The boy had not spoken in 14 months. Not a word, not a whisper, not even in his sleep, which the nursemaid reported was restless and dark, visited by dreams that left him clutching the bedsheets and staring at the ceiling with eyes too old for a 6-year-old face. 3 governesses had come, and 3 had gone. The first had lasted a week, leaving with red-rimmed eyes and a letter of reference that described her time at Linton Manor as an experience she was grateful to survive. The second had been gentle, patient, and completely unequipped for a child who regarded every educational approach as an act of war to be resisted in perfect silence. She had wept in the kitchen, been soothed by the cook, and boarded the morning coach south, with the expression of a woman who had aged 3 years in 10 days. The third had been brought in on the recommendation of a London physician who specialized in childhood ailments of the nervous variety. She had lasted 11 days and had written to the physician on the 12th to inform him that the child was, in her professional opinion, not neurologically impaired, but simply the most immovable human being she had ever encountered, and that she wished him well in finding someone with the requisite constitution. The Duke of Linton had read each letter of resignation with the flat, exhausted composure of a man who had already used up his available grief on something far larger and had nothing left for smaller disappointments. He had filed them in the drawer of his study, with the medical reports, and the specialist's recommendations, and the letter from his wife's mother, which he had read once and never opened again, and he had asked his solicitor to find someone else. His solicitor had found Nora Cavendish. She arrived in March, on a morning when the last of the winter's snow was retreating from the Yorkshire moors, leaving behind a landscape of grey-green and mud, and the tentative, exploratory green of things beginning to grow. The moors stretched away from Linton Manor in every direction, ancient and enormous, pressing the house into the hillside with the patient indifference of a landscape that had been there long before the house and would be there long after. Nora arrived by mail coach, which stopped at the crossroads 2 miles from the estate, and she walked the remaining distance along a track that was more memory than road, her bag on her shoulder, her boots finding the firm ground beneath the mud with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent years navigating difficult terrain. She was 28 years old. She had been educated at the village school in Derbyshire, where her father kept the post office, and then further educated by the 2 years she had spent reading every book in the Linton School lending library, and the subsequent 6 years she had spent teaching at a dame school in Leeds, where her charges had ranged from 4 years old to 14, and had included several children who, for one reason or another, had difficulty with conventional instruction. She had learned, through those years, that silence was not the absence of communication. It was a different language entirely, and she had learned to be patient, the way you had to be patient with a locked door, not by forcing it, but by standing beside it long enough that it began to wonder why you were still there. She had not been told everything. The solicitor's letter had been thorough on practical matters: the wage, the hours, the household routine, the name and age of her charge. It had mentioned, in carefully neutral language, that the child had experienced a significant loss and was currently not communicating verbally, and that the Duke required patience above all other qualifications. It had not told her that the child's mother had died in this house, in this winter, in a room with a view of the moors, 14 months ago. It had not told her that the boy had been beside her when it happened, because the nurses were slow, and the fever was fast, and by the time anyone understood what was occurring, the child had already seen something that no 6-year-old should see. It had not told her that the Duke of Linton, James Ashworth, had not set foot in the eastern wing since his wife's death, that he managed his estate from a study in the West Tower and spent his evenings in the library staring at books he could not bring himself to open, These things Nora learned from the kitchen. The cook, a broad, warm woman named Mrs. Fenwick, fed Nora a bowl of broth the evening she arrived and explained the situation with the direct, compassionate clarity of a woman who had watched the household deteriorate for over a year and was grateful, for the first time, to have someone new to tell it to. "The boy's name is Thomas," Mrs. Fenwick said. "He is 6 years old, and he was the happiest child in Yorkshire before his mother died. Used to come down here and steal biscuits and chase the kitchen cat and ask me the name of every single ingredient in every pot. Talked from the moment he woke to the moment he slept." She paused. Her large hands went still around her mug. After, he just stopped. All at once, like a door closing. The nursemaid said he was in the room when it happened. No one is certain how much he understood. She looked at Nora with eyes that were careful and sad. "The Duke does not speak of it to anyone. He manages and he works. And he sees to Thomas's physical needs with the devotion of a good father. But he is not present. There is a difference, you understand, between a man who is here and a man who is present." "And the boy?" Nora asked. "Thomas eats. He sleeps. He follows instructions when they are simple enough, though he will not look you in the eye, and he will not be touched." The last governess touched his shoulder to guide him to his chair, and he flinched so hard he fell off it. Mrs. Fenwick set down her mug. "He goes out to the garden every morning at 7, alone. Whatever he does out there, it seems to be the one thing that does not cause him distress." "What does he do in the garden?" "Watches. Mostly. The birds. The insects. Once I found him lying completely flat on his stomach, on the cold ground for an hour, watching a beetle cross a stone. He was so still, I thought he had fallen ill." A pause. "He is a good boy, Miss Cavendish. He is not broken. He is buried. And whatever buried him, it buried him deep." Nora slept in a room in the north wing, plain and adequate, with a window that looked over the kitchen garden and, beyond it, the edge of the moors. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind moving through the heather, and thought about what she knew of children who had seen things too large for them. She thought about the time at the Leeds school when a girl of 7 had stopped speaking after her brother drowned in the canal. She had not tried to coax the girl to speak. She had sat beside her at the classroom window every morning and watched the street below and described aloud, quietly, whatever she saw: the cart horse with the mismatched shoes, the baker's boy dropping his rolls, the sparrow building its nest in the postbox. And on the 6th day, the girl had said, without turning her head, "That sparrow is going to be disappointed. The eggs won't fit." And the door had opened. Nora closed her eyes. She thought about beetles on stones and boys who watched. She met Thomas the following morning. He was in the garden at 7, as Mrs. Fenwick had said he would be. The garden at Linton Manor was a walled space behind the east wing, enclosed on 3 sides by old stone walls, covered in dormant climbing roses, and on the 4th by the house itself. It had been beautiful once. Evidence remained in the bones of the planting, the curved borders, the stone paths, the central bed that had clearly been designed as a formal parterre. But without a gardener's consistent attention, it had drifted toward wildness. Last summer's growth was brown and tangled. Weeds had found the paths. The rose canes grew unpruned and leggy. It was a garden in the early stages of becoming something else, caught between order and wilderness. And in the thin March light, it looked exactly like what it was. A space that had once been loved by someone who was no longer there. Thomas stood at the far end of the central path. He was small, for 6, slight, and dark-haired like his father, with narrow shoulders hunched slightly, inside a coat that was a fraction too large. He stood very still, His face turned toward the stone wall, where a tangle of old rose canes was threaded through with dried seed heads. And he was watching something with the concentrated, absolute attention that Mrs. Fenwick had described. His hands were at his sides. His feet were planted. He did not move. Nora stood at the entrance to the garden and observed him for a long moment. Then she walked, slowly and without urgency, along the side path that ran parallel to his position. She did not approach him directly. She angled toward the stone wall, 6 feet to his left, and stopped there, as though she had come to look at the wall herself. She looked at the rose canes. In the gray morning light, she could see what had drawn him. A brown wren was threading itself through the tangle of canes with the fluid, impossibly swift confidence of a creature that understood its environment on a cellular level. It moved so fast, it was more suggestion than bird, a flickering shape that vanished and reappeared, vanished and reappeared. Nora watched it. She said nothing. Beside her, at the periphery of her vision, she saw Thomas register her presence. His head turned slightly. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze on the wren. The wren disappeared into the canes and did not reappear for a full minute. Then it burst out from the far end, with a crumb in its beak, and vanished over the wall. Nora put her hands in her coat pockets. "It has been building," she said. "Not to Thomas. Not to anyone in particular. Simply to the air. In the same way one might think aloud. The nest. It has been at it since before I arrived, I think. There must be a warm spot in the canes, where the wall catches the south sun." She paused. Thomas did not move. "It will have eggs by April," Nora said. 3, usually. Sometimes 4. Brown, with reddish spots, the size of a fingernail. Nothing. Thomas was still, but the slight tension in his shoulders, the coiled, defensive readiness of a child, expecting to be addressed, expected to perform, was not present. He was listening. He was doing it invisibly, the way children do when they believe themselves unobserved, with their whole bodies. Nora turned and walked back inside. She did not speak to him. She did not introduce herself. She did not explain who she was or why she was there. She simply returned to the kitchen, accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Fenwick, and ate her breakfast. The next morning, she returned to the garden at 7. The wren was back. Nora stood at the wall and watched it. Thomas stood 6 feet away and watched it. Neither of them spoke. Nora noted that he had moved 2 feet closer than the day before. On the third morning, he was standing 4 feet away. On the fourth morning, he was beside her. Nora did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the rose canes, where the wren was conducting its morning industry, with the focused determination of a creature that had no time for doubt. "There are 2 of them," she said, in the same conversational, but not directed tone she had used on the first morning. "The male and the female. The male is slightly brighter. You can tell by the tail. He keeps it higher." A pause. The wren disappeared into the canes. "He sings before dawn," Nora continued. "I heard him this morning through the window. A wren's song is ridiculously large for the size of the bird, like a very small person making a very enormous statement." Beside her, in the cold morning air, something happened. Something so small, it might have been imagined. Thomas's breath changed. The rhythm of it shifted, barely perceptibly, from the tight, controlled breathing of a child, in a defensive state, to something infinitesimally more open. Nora noted it. She said nothing about it. She went inside. She did not establish a schoolroom immediately. She did not present books, or slates, or arrange a desk with small chairs, and the traditional machinery of childhood education. Instead, she requested from Mrs. Fenwick a supply of plain paper, a jar of good pencils, and a field guide to British birds that she had spotted in the library on her first evening. She brought these to the garden on the 5th morning and set them on the stone ledge that ran along the south wall. She drew. She sat on the ledge in the cold morning air and drew the wren with a quick, confident hand, the small body compact, the tail raised, the beak holding an invisible thread of nesting material. She was not a particularly skilled artist. The drawing was honest rather than beautiful, accurate in proportion and posture rather than fine in execution. But it was true to the bird, and she labeled it carefully below. Troglodytes, troglodytes. Common wren. Thomas stood 6 inches from her right elbow and watched her draw. When she finished, she set the paper on the ledge and put her pencil down. Thomas looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he reached out and picked it up. He held it with both hands, with the careful, almost reverent grip of a child who understood that some things required gentle handling. He studied the drawing for perhaps 3 minutes, in complete silence, with the same focused concentration he gave the bird itself. Then he set it back on the ledge, precisely where it had been. Nora picked up the jar of pencils. She placed it beside the stack of paper. She went inside. The following morning, she arrived to find a drawing already on the stone ledge. It was the wren, done in pencil, in a child's hand, unpracticed, and proportionally uneven, but unmistakable. The tail was correct. The beak was correct. The compact, round-bodied posture of the bird, which was the most distinctive thing about it, was entirely correct. Beneath it, written in careful letters, the concentration of each stroke visible in the pressure of the pencil. Wren. Nora sat on the ledge. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she picked up her own pencil and wrote, beneath the child's label, Troglodytes, troglodytes, smallest of the singers. She placed the drawing back on the ledge. She looked at the rose canes. The wren shot through them like a small brown arrow. Thomas arrived 7 minutes later. He stopped when he saw the drawing. He picked it up. He read what she had written. He set it back down. He sat beside her on the ledge, 6 inches of cold stone between them. They watched the wren. The schoolroom opened on the 10th day. Not in the formal room that had been prepared by the previous governesses with its rigid desk and its alphabets pinned to the wall, but at the kitchen table, which was large, warm, and smelled of bread, and where Mrs. Fenwick moved between the range and the preparation counter with a rhythm that was soothing in its ordinariness. Nora had asked permission. Mrs. Fenwick had said, in a voice that was not quite steady, of course, as many mornings as you like. Nora brought the bird book, and the paper, and the pencils. She opened the bird book on the table. She did not ask Thomas to read it. She began reading it herself, aloud, in the same quiet, not quite directed voice she used in the garden, reading the way she might, if she were alone, and simply thinking out loud. The wren, she read, weighs approximately 9 grams. The same as 3 sheets of paper. She tore 3 sheets from the stack and placed them in her palm, feeling their weight. She placed them on the table in front of where Thomas sat. He looked at them. He placed his own hand over them, feeling. She continued. She read about territory and song and the male wren's tendency to build multiple nests for the female to inspect. She read about migration, about the particular architecture of the wren's nest, a dome of moss and feathers with a small, perfectly circular entrance hole. She read slowly, stopping to look at the illustrations, making small notes in the margin about things she wanted to remember. Thomas listened. He looked at the illustrations. On the 2nd day, he began making his own notes in the margin, small pencil additions beside hers, an arrow indicating something in the illustration, a question mark beside a word he did not understand, a cross-reference to something they had seen in the garden. The question mark appeared first, beside the word fledgling. Nora looked at the question mark. She looked at Thomas. He was looking at the book, not at her. A fledgling, she said quietly, is a young bird that has grown its feathers but has not yet learned to fly. It has left the nest but has not left the ground. It is the most dangerous time. It is also, I think, the bravest thing a bird does. It jumps without being certain the air will hold it. Thomas looked at the word fledgling for a long time. He did not respond. He reached out and erased the question mark with the small rubber on the end of his pencil. Then he drew, in its place, a tiny bird with short wings, standing on the ground, looking up. Nora did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. She pressed her teeth together and looked at the kitchen range and breathed until the moment passed. She did not tell the Duke. James Ashworth had acknowledged her arrival with a brief, formal meeting in his study on her first day. He had been courteous, distant, and entirely unlike the man she had constructed from Mrs. Fenwick's description, by which she meant he was far more closed than she had anticipated, and far younger than grief had any right to make a person look. He was 33. He looked older, not in the way of age, but in the way of weight, the long, stooped carry of a man who had been bearing something that should have been shared and had not been. He had told her his expectations clearly. Thomas's education was to resume mathematics, reading, writing, geography, the standard curriculum for a boy of his station. He was grateful for her willingness to take the position. He would not interfere with her methods. He asked only that she report any significant change in the child's condition and that she not distress him. He said this last part with a particular, specific emphasis, and in the slight crease between his brows as he said it, Nora read everything the solicitor's letter had not told her. He was not protecting the child from distress. He was protecting both of them, the boy from further damage, and himself from knowing the details of it. Of course, she said. She left his study and did not return for 2 weeks. The lessons continued. Nora expanded their territory slowly, the way you expand the territory of any cautious animal, by making the new ground feel continuous with the known. From the bird book, they moved to a field guide to insects, from insects to the plants of the moors, from plants to the extraordinary patient science of how things grew, how a seed knew to grow downward before it grew up, how a tree's rings recorded every drought and abundance, how the smallest organisms in the soil were responsible for everything visible above it. Thomas had not spoken, but he had filled 14 sheets of paper with drawings and notes and cross-references. He had begun arriving to the morning garden sessions before Nora did, his footprints already in the mud, evidence of a boy who had been out earlier than 7 and returned inside before she arrived to preserve the appearance of coincidence. He had begun leaving questions on the kitchen table in the morning, written in his careful, deliberate hand, before she came downstairs. How do birds know which direction is south? Why do leaves change color before they fall? Is the moor older than the house? Nora answered each question in writing beside his, and then, if the question was complex enough, in the subsequent lesson, she treated his written questions with the same serious, thorough attention she would have given a spoken one, because she understood that for Thomas, writing was not a substitute for speaking. It was the form of speech he had found he could still use, and she intended to honor it. On the 19th day, she was in the garden alone at 7, drawing a great tit she had spotted on the wall, when she heard his footsteps on the path behind her. She heard him stop. She heard the pause that preceded what came next. "The tail," said Thomas. "You have the tail wrong." His voice was so small and so rusty with disuse that it barely carried the 3 feet between them. It arrived in the cold morning air, like something fragile, something that had been kept in a box for a very long time and was uncertain of the light. Nora looked at her drawing. She looked at the great tit on the wall. She looked at her drawing again. "You are right," she said. She adjusted the tail. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the paper and corrected the angle of the bird's tail with 3 small, careful strokes. She did not congratulate him, or exclaim, or make any sign that what had just occurred was the first word spoken by a child who had been silent for 14 months. She treated it as what it was: a correction, a contribution, a small, quiet participation in the work they were doing together. "Better?" she asked. Behind her, a pause, then, "Better." She set down the pencil. She looked at the great tit. It looked back at her with its sharp, watchful eye, and then it flew away over the wall with a bright, decisive flutter of wings. "Shall we go in?" Nora said. "Mrs. Fenwick said there would be porridge." "With the cinnamon?" His voice was gaining steadiness with each word, like a machine warming up, parts finding their rhythm. She promised. The footsteps moved. Thomas came alongside her on the path. She was careful not to look at his face. She walked beside him toward the kitchen door, and he walked beside her, and the distance between them was perhaps 18 inches, which was the closest he had allowed anyone since his mother died. In the kitchen, Mrs. Fenwick was at the range with her back to the door. She heard them come in. She did not turn around. Nora saw the housekeeper's shoulders go still for one moment, and then deliberately resume their movement, stirring the pot, not turning, not making this into something that required acknowledgement. "Sit down then," Mrs. Fenwick said to the pot. "It's nearly ready." They sat down. They ate their porridge. Thomas had the cinnamon. Nora sent a note to the Duke that evening. It was brief. "Thomas spoke this morning. 2 words, but he spoke. He is making progress in his own time. I believe he will continue." She did not report the magnitude of it. She did not describe the quality of the voice, or the rust in it, or the way the cold air had seemed to hold the sound for a moment after it was spoken, as though the garden itself were uncertain whether to believe what it had heard. She did not report it because some things did not benefit from being reported. They benefited from being allowed to continue quietly, undisturbed, without the complicated weight of an adult's hope falling on them before they were strong enough to bear it. The Duke came to her that evening. She was in the small sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, writing in the field notebook she kept to track Thomas's progress, when she heard the knock. She opened the door to find James Ashworth standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who had received news he did not know how to carry. He was in his shirt sleeves. She registered this because it was unexpected, because she had only seen him in his formal clothes, the careful armor of a duke, and in shirt sleeves he looked different, younger, more unmade. His dark hair, which was always precisely ordered, was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hand through it. "Your note," he said. "Yes." He spoke. 2 words. "This morning in the garden. He told me I had the bird's tail wrong." James Ashworth stood in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood with one hand on the frame, and he was very still, in the way that people are still when the alternative is coming apart. "He corrected you," James said. "He was right. I had the tail at the wrong angle." A pause. He pressed his lips together. His jaw worked. "The last time he spoke," James said, slowly, carefully, the way one handles something that might break, he told his mother that the soup was too hot. He stopped. That was the morning of the day she died. He brought her soup from the kitchen because he thought it might help, and she was already too ill to eat it. And he said to her, "Mama, the soup is too hot. Wait for it to cool." And she said, "I will, my love. Thank you." And those were the last words they said to each other, and he has not spoken since. The corridor was very quiet. The house pressed around them, old and stone, and full of its particular, absorbing silence. Then he has good reason to be careful with words, Nora said softly. James looked at her. His eyes, which were dark like Thomas's and carried the same quality of watchful intelligence, were very bright. "What did you do?" he said. "The other governesses. They tried everything. Encouragement. Reward. One of them apparently told him it was not what his mother would have wanted. He didn't speak, but he did throw a book at her." He paused. "I was not sorry. What did you do differently?" "Nothing," Nora said. "That cannot be true." "It is. I did not try to make him speak. I simply gave him something worth speaking about." James looked at her for a long time. In the lamplight of the corridor, his face was unguarded in a way she suspected it rarely was. The formal distance, the careful blankness she had observed at their first meeting, was not present. In its place was something raw and grateful and very tired. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low. "Thank Thomas," Nora said. "He did the hard part." James nodded. He remained in the doorway for a moment longer, as though there were something else he had come to say, and had not yet found the shape of it. Then he said goodnight, and walked back down the corridor toward the west wing. Nora closed her door. She sat back at her desk. She looked at the field notebook, and at the neat, accumulating record of Thomas's progress, and thought about the Duke, standing in his shirt sleeves in her doorway, with his hand running through his already disordered hair. And she thought that grief did something very particular to intelligent people. It made them precise in their avoidance of the very things they most needed. She picked up her pen and continued her notes. Spring came. The moors turned green, then purple at their edges, as the heather began to bud. The kitchen garden filled with the tentative first growth of the season. The rose canes in the walled garden put out leaves, then buds, then the first tight, furled flowers of the year. Thomas talked. Not continuously, not yet, not with the unstoppable, tumbling energy Mrs. Fenwick described from before. He talked the way someone begins to use a limb after a long injury, carefully, testing the weight, building strength incrementally. He talked about birds and insects, and the growth patterns of lichen on the north face of the wall. He talked about mathematics, which he discovered had the same orderly, satisfying logic as taxonomy. He talked about the moors, which he could see from the schoolroom window, and which he regarded with the complicated, proprietary love of a child who had grown up with a landscape as his nearest companion. He did not talk about his mother. Nora did not ask him to. She held the space open, as she had held open every other space, with patience, with the quiet confidence that what needed to come would come when it was ready. He asked, one morning over the field guide, "Do birds know when something is gone?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think so," she said. "Not the way we know, but when a mate is lost, many birds stop singing. The territory goes quiet. The naturalists call it a grief period." Thomas looked at the illustration of a pair of wrens, the male and the female, the tail heights different, the postures oriented toward each other. "And then they sing again?" he said. "Then they sing again." Thomas turned the page. He did not say anything else. But that evening, Nora heard him in the corridor outside his room, humming. It was tuneless and quiet, barely there, the sound a child makes when they think no one is listening. She stood outside her own door and listened until it stopped. James had begun to appear, not at the lessons, not initially, but at the edges of things. At breakfast, which he had previously taken alone in his study, he began coming down to the dining room. He arrived 10 minutes after Nora and Thomas, which she understood was deliberate, a way of entering the space without demanding the adjustment that would accompany a formal arrival. He sat at the far end of the table and read his correspondence and ate his eggs, and Thomas, from the other end, glanced at him periodically with the carefully unreadable expression of a child monitoring a situation. Then one morning, James asked Thomas about the great tit. He asked it, without looking up from his correspondence, in a voice that was entirely, almost unconvincingly casual. The bird Miss Cavendish was drawing. Last week, you said the tail was wrong. What did you mean? Thomas looked at him. The monitoring expression shifted, by a degree, into something else. The tail angle, Thomas said. When a great tit perches, the tail points down, not out. She had it pointing out. She corrected it. Eventually. James glanced at Nora over the top of his correspondence. She kept her eyes on her toast. James said. He returned to his letter. Thomas returned to his porridge. But when he looked down at his bowl, he was not quite suppressing a small, private expression that was almost, very almost, something near a smile. After that, James came to breakfast regularly. The table rearranged itself, not by plan, but by gradual, daily negotiation, until father and son sat at the same end rather than the opposite ends, with Nora across from them, and the morning conversations, limited though they were, began to include all three of them. It was slow. It was halting. Thomas and his father had been living in the same house for 14 months, without truly occupying the same space, and the habits of parallel grief were not dissolved quickly, but they were being dissolved, day by day, in the way that frost dissolves in warming air. So gradually, it was hard to identify the moment when the ground became merely cold rather than frozen. The wren's nest was finished in April. Nora and Thomas discovered it on a Tuesday morning, a perfect dome of moss and feathers, tucked into the deepest angle of the rose canes. They stood before it, without speaking, with the particular, shared reverence of two people witnessing something that had been done entirely without them, and was all the more marvelous for it. James came into the garden that morning for the first time since winter. He came without announcement, appearing at the gate with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and Thomas looked up and saw him and did not look away. "There is a wren's nest," Thomas said. "I heard." James walked along the path toward them. He stopped beside Thomas. He looked at the nest without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother used to watch the wrens. Every spring." Thomas was very still. "She said they were the bravest birds," James continued, his voice carefully controlled, carefully quiet. "Because they were so small. She said something that small, singing that loudly, was an act of courage." Thomas looked at his father. He looked at the nest. He looked back at his father. "She told me that too," Thomas said. The words arrived in the spring garden, with the same quality as Thomas's first words had arrived, carefully, out of disuse, carrying more weight than their syllables suggested. James looked at his son, and Thomas looked at his father, and Nora turned and walked very quietly to the other end of the garden, and gave them the space that the moment required. She stood at the far wall, and looked out over the moors, and felt the cold wind on her face, and let the sharp brightness in her eyes resolve itself into tears that she wiped quickly and without ceremony on the back of her hand. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of voices. She could not make out the words. She did not try to. The words were not for her. She stayed at the far wall for 20 minutes. When she turned, Thomas and James were sitting on the garden bench together. Thomas had a pencil and his field notebook. James was looking at the rose canes, and his face was not the face of a man in the mechanical performance of presence. It was the face of a man who was actually there. She walked back along the side path toward the house. She paused at the gate. "I will begin the Latin grammar this afternoon," she said, to both of them, "and neither, if anyone is interested." "I might attend," James said, without turning around. I am entirely unsurprised, Nora said. She went inside. May arrived. The garden bloomed. The wren's eggs hatched, 3 of them, exactly as Nora had predicted, spotted and small as fingernails. Thomas recorded the event in his field notebook, with the concentrated precision of a naturalist 10 years older, and reported the data to both Nora and his father, with the formal, suppressed excitement of a boy who was learning to contain his joy so that it lasted longer. James had begun attending the afternoon lessons. He claimed it was for the Latin grammar, which was, by any measure, a transparent fiction. His Latin was considerably better than Nora's. He sat at the kitchen table, with his long legs folded into the too small chair, and made occasional, dryly accurate observations about Nora's declension explanations that forced her to correct her own corrections and that made Thomas cover his mouth with his hand. The dative, James said one afternoon, is not the case for the object that receives the action. It is the case for the person to whom something is given or done. There is a distinction. The distinction is subtle, Nora said. The distinction is fundamental. Your Grace, I am teaching a 7-year-old. All the more reason to be precise. Children tolerate imprecision badly. They simply do not have the vocabulary to object. Thomas, who was watching this exchange with the transfixed attention of a child watching something unexpected unfold, said, "She is right about most things." "I am delighted to hear it," James said. "Tell me when she is wrong, and I will keep a record." Nora looked at the Duke of Linton. This man who had been absent from his own life for 14 months and was now sitting in his kitchen interrupting her Latin grammar lesson with pedantic accuracy and entirely insufficient remorse. He caught her looking. Something in his expression shifted. The dry, careful control softened at its edges, and beneath it, she saw the same thing she had seen in the corridor that night. The unguarded face of a man who was beginning, carefully, to be grateful. She looked back at her grammar book. "Dative," she said. "Thomas, give me an example of the dative case." "The father gives the lesson to the governess," Thomas said, deadpan. A pause. Then James made a sound she had not heard from him before. A short, involuntary, entirely genuine sound of amusement. It cracked out of him the way the wren's song cracked out of its small body, disproportionately large, startling to everyone, including himself. Thomas looked at his father. His eyes were wide and bright. He had not heard his father laugh in 14 months either. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Fenwick, at the range with her back firmly turned, said, without inflection, "The dative then," and the lesson resumed. June. The wren fledglings left the nest. Thomas watched them go on a Thursday morning, from the bench in the garden, with the focused, accepting attention of someone who had known it was coming and had decided to receive it properly rather than be ambushed by it. The 3 small birds emerged from the nest over the course of a morning, each one balancing on the edge of the rose canes, with its 2 short wings spread, looking out at the unfamiliar enormity of the world. James sat beside Thomas on the bench. He had begun doing this, appearing in the garden in the mornings, taking the space that had slowly extended its invitation. He sat without speaking, which was a kind of fluency Nora had not expected from him. He had spent 14 months in speech that was formal, dutiful, and managed. He was relearning silence as a different thing, as a presence rather than an absence. The first fledgling jumped. It fell 6 inches and recovered, its wings catching the air with the clumsy, wild exhilaration of something discovering what it was made for. It landed on the path and sat there, panting, radiating the particular, undignified triumph of a creature that has done something terrifying and survived. "She did it," Thomas said. "She," James repeated. The braver ones are usually the females. Nora said so. James glanced at Nora, who was standing at the wall with her notebook and a pencil, making no pretense of doing anything other than watching. She said so, James repeated. His voice was very dry and very warm at the same time. She knows a great deal about birds. She knows a great deal about many things. Nora wrote something in her notebook with great concentration. By the end of June, all 3 fledglings had left the garden. Thomas marked their departure in his field notebook with a date and a brief summary, and then sat looking at the empty rose canes for a long time with the expression of someone who was practicing the art of letting something go. "The nest will stay," Nora said, from the wall. "They often reuse them." Thomas looked at the nest. He looked at the canes, the tangle of them, the small dome invisible now, without the knowledge of where to look. "I know," he said. Nora wrote the date in her own notebook. She wrote, "Thomas is well." Then she added, after a moment's consideration, "The household is recovered." She was not certain this was accurate. She was not certain recovery was the correct word for what had happened, because recovery suggested a return to what existed before. And nothing at Linton Manor was what it had been before. Thomas was not the boy he had been before his mother died. James was not the man he had been before he was a widower. Linton Manor was not the house it had been when it was full of a woman's voice and a child's constant, unstoppable talk. But it was alive again. It was inhabited again. The rooms had been opened, not literally, not all of them. Some would remain closed for longer, perhaps always, and that was permitted. But the house breathed again. The kitchen table was used in the evenings. The garden was tended. Thomas ran in the corridor when he thought no one was listening and had to be reminded, gently, that the practice was technically prohibited indoors. James came to find her one evening in July. She was in the library, which she had taken to using in the evenings when the household was settled, surrounded by the Duke's extensive collection of natural history texts, which were exceptional, and sitting in the chair by the window that looked out over the moors in the long gold light of the summer evening. She heard his knock and said, "Come in," and he came in and stood among the books with the slight, self-conscious formality of a man about to say something he has been rehearsing. She put her book down. She folded her hands. She waited. "You have been with us 4 months," James said. "Yes. In 4 months, you have achieved what 3 professional governesses, 2 physicians, and my mother-in-law could not in 14. "Thomas achieved it," Nora said. "I simply gave him the conditions." The conditions were not simple. The conditions required patience and perception and the ability to understand a child's silence as something other than a problem to be solved. "I had a good teacher," Nora said. "A girl in Leeds who hadn't spoken in 2 months, and a sparrow nesting in a postbox, and the very specific lesson that you cannot push someone through a door they are not ready to open." James was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the moors, the same moors she had been looking at, bathed in the same evening gold. "My wife loved this view," he said. "I know. Thomas told me. He told me she would sit at this window in the morning and name the hills. She said, they each had a personality." James turned to look at her. His expression was very open, very still. "He told you that?" "He tells me many things. He is a very communicative child, now that he has rediscovered the mechanism." "What does he say about her?" Nora looked at him carefully. This was a question he had needed to ask for a long time, and she considered how to answer it. "He says she made the best hot chocolate. He says she let him sleep in her bed during thunderstorms, and told him that lightning was just the sky clearing its throat. He says she knew every bird's name without a field guide, and that she sang while she cooked, badly. and didn't mind being told so. James pressed his lips together. His hand went to the window frame. He says, Nora continued quietly, that she smelled like lavender and ink, because she wrote letters constantly and kept lavender in the desk drawer. He says, she read to him every night before bed, always from the middle of the book and never the beginning, because she said the middles of books were the most honest part. James's head bent. His shoulders curved inward. Nora watched the grief move through him. Not the managed, suppressed grief he had been carrying for 14 months, like a stone under his coat, but something that moved, that breathed, that was permitted to exist in the room rather than being sealed in a drawer with letters of resignation. She sounds, Nora said, like a remarkable woman. She was, James said. His voice was very low. She was the most patient person I have ever known. She saw the best version of everything, including me. A pause. I have not been the best version of myself this past year. No, Nora agreed. But you have been present more often than you know. Thomas knows you are there. He is watching. The way he watches the wren. He is accumulating evidence. He will reach his conclusions in his own time. James turned from the window. He looked at her. This woman in his library in the summer evening, sitting in his wife's chair, with his wife's books open on the table, and the moors that his wife loved beyond the window. How do you do it? He asked. You came here a stranger. You knew nothing of us. And yet you saw through everything. The silence, the management, all of it. Straight to what mattered. I listen, Nora said, to what people say, and to what they do not say, and I try to be in the right place when the door opens. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, steady, as she held everything. Stay, he said. It was a single word, and it carried with it the entire weight of 4 months and 14 prior months, and the particular vulnerability of a man asking for something he is not certain he has any right to ask. I intend to, Nora said. Thomas has only just reached the compound sentences in his Latin grammar. I cannot abandon him before he masters the ablative. James looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The formal distance dissolving. The grief retreating one incremental degree. And beneath it, she saw, for the first time clearly, the man he was before the loss had compressed him. Intelligent, dry, fond, and capable, she suspected, of a great deal of warmth. The ablative, he said, may take some time. I anticipate so. Then I suppose you will be here for a while. I suppose I will. He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor and turned back to the window. The moors were deep gold now. The last light of the evening, clinging to the heather. A wren was singing somewhere below, invisible, enormous. She picked up her book. She began to read. She was smiling. August turned the moors purple. Heather covered the hillsides in great sweeping carpets that rolled to the horizon, and Thomas walked in it for hours, with Nora sometimes, and sometimes alone, filling his field notebook with observations, and samples and questions that he would bring back to the kitchen table, and they would answer together, the three of them, father and son, and the woman who had come to teach, and had instead, quietly, without design, become the person around whom the household oriented itself, the way a compass orients to north. James walked with them on Sundays. He walked the way he did most things, thoroughly, and without unnecessary conversation. But the silence between them had long since ceased to be uncomfortable, and had become instead the particular, companionable quiet of people who had nothing to prove to each other. One Sunday in late August, Thomas ran ahead on the path, following a lark that had risen from the heather in a long spiraling ascent, and James and Nora walked behind, and for a long time neither of them spoke. He laughed yesterday, James said. Properly. Mrs. Fenwick dropped the measuring spoons and he laughed, and I had forgotten what it sounded like. What does it sound like? His mother's laugh. But his own. He paused. Is that possible? To sound like someone and entirely yourself at the same time? I think it is the best kind of possible, Nora said. James looked at her. The August light was on her face, catching the darkness of her hair, the precise, clear gray of her eyes. She was looking at Thomas on the path ahead, her expression warm and uncomplicated. The expression of a woman who did not perform her feelings, but simply had them. Miss Cavendish, he said. Nora, she said. As she always said, gently, consistently, every time he used her title. Nora. He said it the way he said most things that mattered. Carefully, with attention. I am aware that the appropriate professional boundaries of your position do not accommodate what I am about to say. I am not greatly concerned with appropriate professional boundaries, Nora said. You are remarkably consistent in this. I am consistently correct. There is a distinction. The corner of his mouth moved. The same almost smile she had been cataloging for months. Each occurrence a small addition to a record that was growing in the same notebook she kept Thomas's progress. She had not told anyone about that record. She would not. Some observations were for keeping, not reporting. I would like, James said, to know you. Properly. Not as Thomas's teacher. Not as a member of the household staff. As a person. You have known me for 4 months, Nora said. I have observed you for 4 months. I have been grateful to you for 4 months. I have sat in your Latin grammar lessons and corrected your declensions, which is an activity that requires a certain degree of familiarity. It requires pedantry, Nora said. The two are not the same. Nora. She stopped walking. She turned to face him. In the great, purple sweep of the moors, with Thomas's distant figure outlined against the sky, and the lark still rising somewhere above them, she looked at the Duke of Linton, and found, as she had been finding for months, a man who was becoming recognizable to her, whose silences she knew, and whose particular laugh she had filed in the same part of her mind that filed things she intended to keep. I know you, she said. I know that you take your tea too hot, and drink it too fast, and burn your tongue every morning, and say nothing about it. I know you leave notes for Mrs. Fenwick, about Thomas's preferences, before I have had a chance to mention them, because you have been observing him more than anyone knows. I know that you sat up all night last week in the library when the storm was bad because Thomas was frightened and you wanted to be nearby without making a production of it. James was very still. I know, Nora said, that you loved your wife, with the kind of love that leaves a person altered, and that the alteration is permanent, and that I would not ask you to be unaltered because it is part of who you are. I know that you are trying to be present for your son, with a courage that is invisible to most people, because it is quiet and daily and does not announce itself. She paused. You do not need to know me, James. You already do. You have been knowing me the same way I have been knowing you, through the daily accumulation of small, true things. And the question is not whether we know each other. The question is whether you are ready to admit that we do. James looked at her. His dark eyes were very clear in the August light. I am asking for time, he said. I am not recovered. I am not certain I will ever be what I was before. But I am here, in a way I was not 6 months ago, and that is because of you. And if you are willing to wait, not for a man who is healed, but for one who is healing, then I would like very much to try. Nora looked at him. She looked at Thomas, a small figure on the horizon, standing still, looking up at the sky, where the lark was still singing, its song cascading down to them in the August air. I am not going anywhere, she said. I have the ablative to finish. James exhaled. It was a long, quiet breath, the kind that releases something held too tight for too long. September. The heather faded. The moors turned russet and brown. The nights arrived earlier, carrying the particular damp cold of Yorkshire autumn, and Linton Manor closed itself in against the season. Fires lit in the rooms, curtains drawn at dusk, the house filling with the accumulated warmth of people who were actually living in it. Thomas had begun to read aloud at dinner, not from educational texts, from whatever he was currently interested in, his field notebook, the natural history books, a collection of Norse mythology that Nora had found in the library and that he was working through with the same absorbed concentration he gave to everything. He read with the halting but determined fluency of a child who had recently rediscovered that words, said aloud, were not things to be afraid of. James listened. Every evening, he sat at the dinner table and listened to his son read, and his face in the candlelight was the face of a man who had been given something back that he had thought he would never have again. Mrs. Fenwick served the meals and retreated to the kitchen and occasionally paused in the doorway to listen, a small, unguarded smile on her face, before remembering herself and returning to the range. One evening in October, Thomas looked up from his reading and said to Nora, "Will you always be here?" The question landed in the candle-lit dining room with a child's complete, undefended directness. Nora looked at Thomas. She looked at James, who was very still across the table, waiting. "For as long as you need me," she said. Thomas considered this. "I will probably always need a teacher," he said. "That seems likely. And Papa might need someone to correct his Latin." "An ongoing requirement," Nora agreed. Thomas looked at his father. "You could ask her to stay always," he said, with the tranquil, problem-solving logic of a child who had identified a solution and could not understand why the adults in the room had not already implemented it. A very long pause. "I intend to," James said. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. Across the candlelit table, across the weeks and months of small, true, accumulating things, across the grief and the silence and the fledglings leaving the nest and the Latin grammar and the wrens singing where no one could see it. Eventually, James added, quiet and certain, "when the time is right." Nora looked at her plate. She was, for perhaps the second time since arriving at Linton Manor, very close to crying. "The ablative," she said. "The ablative," James agreed. Thomas looked between them with the expression of a child who has understood something important and has decided not to examine it too closely, in case examining it causes it to stop being true. He returned to his book. He read about the Norse god Freyr, who was associated with sunshine and fair weather and the growing of things. His voice was steady and clear and entirely his own. A voice that had been buried under the weight of grief for 14 months and had been coaxed back, not by force or urgency, but by patience and wrens, and the simple radical act of two people sitting beside a child in the cold morning garden and giving him something worth speaking about. Outside the windows of Linton Manor, the autumn deepened. The moors went dark. The stars came out over Yorkshire, more stars than any city sky permitted, dense and cold and impossibly far away. Inside, a lamp burned in the dining room. A boy read aloud. A man listened with his whole body. A woman kept a notebook in which she recorded the daily, incremental miracle of a household coming back to life. The wren's nest waited in the rose canes, patient, empty, ready for spring. Thank you for listening to this story. If the quiet courage of Nora and the slow return of Thomas and his father moved you, please give this video a like and share it with anyone who loves a slow burn story built on patience rather than grand gestures. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment that stayed with you? Thomas's first two words, the wren's nest, or the evening on the moors. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.